जिसे बूटी लाई हूँ पीर मेरे चुकनी जी ए भी अल्लाह वाले अंदी चुकनी जी ए भी अल्लाह वाले अंदी चुक चुकनी जी चुक चुकनी जी चुक चुकनी जी चुक चुकनी जी
from the minds of its citizens is something that we've been grappling with in various ways on ChinaFile over the past couple of months. And we'll talk about some of that work in a bit, but I hope you will take some time to visit the website, which is ChinaFile.com, and explore some of the articles that we've published on this subject. You can also follow us on Twitter, on Facebook, on Instagram, and we also have a mostly weekly newsletter that you can subscribe to on our website. So we are so pleased to welcome back to the Asia Society Nicholas Kristof, Zha Jianying, who, like Orville Schell, who is our Arthur Ross Director of the Center on U.S.-China Relations at the Asia Society, and also ChinaFile's publisher. All three of them were eyewitnesses to the events in Beijing in 1989 and also chroniclers of what happened. So they're really exactly the right people to have tonight's discussion. Before I invite them up, I just want to make a couple of quick announcements of upcoming programs that you won't want to miss. On June 13th, Anna Fitfield, who is currently the Beijing bureau chief for the Washington Post, will be here to discuss her new book, The Great Successor, The Divinely Perfect Destiny of Brilliant Comrade Kim Jong-un, which is about North Korea. And she will be discussing that with our own divinely brilliant comrade, Danny Russell, who is the Asia Society Policy Institute's Vice President for International Security and Diplomacy, and also a former Assistant Secretary of State for East Asia. June 17th is the next installment in Asia Society's Asian in America series, and it will feature two path-breaking Asian American members of Congress, Grace Meng, who is a fourth-term congressman from the New York 6th, which is in Queens, and Andy Kim, who won a nail-bitingly close race in November to become the freshman congressman from the New Jersey 3rd District. These are two incredibly dynamic public servants, and you won't want to miss them. So tickets are on sale at asiasociety.org. And finally, on June 18th, Orville will be back to interview Ambassador Winston Lord, who served for many years as an aide to Henry Kissinger at the beginning of what would be a long and highly distinguished career as an American diplomat. Ambassador Lord's book, based on a series of interviews he conducted with Kissinger, is formidably entitled Kissinger on Kissinger, with an introduction by Henry Kissinger. So that's sure to be an illuminating conversation. And again, that's on June 18th. Just a quick reminder that tonight's discussion will be live streamed. And during the second half of the program, you will have a chance to ask questions to the panelists. Please wait until you receive a microphone before you ask your question. And to those of you who are watching online, if you have a question for the panelists, you can either email it to moderator@asiasociety.org, or you can tweet it with the hashtag AsiaSocietyLive. And now please join me in welcoming Orville Schell, Zha Jianying, and Nick Kristof.
Here we go.
All right.
I think you're here.
Unlike when Chinese leaders file into the Great Hall of the People, there's no political significance to the way that we've just come on stage. Tonight is 30 years to the day since the People's Liberation Army troops opened fire on civilians on the streets of Beijing. But as I said just a minute ago when I was standing over there, the subject we're here to discuss tonight is not so much what took place in 1989, but rather the Chinese government's efforts to expunge those events from collective memory, from national history, and from the memories of individual Chinese citizens. And so we want to talk about that process and what kind of impact it's had on China's politics and society and on its interactions with other parts of the world. But before we do that, in part to set the scene and in part to highlight the stakes of this exploration, I want to ask Nick and Jianying and Orville to each briefly describe a moment that spring that has stood out particularly prominently in your own memories of 1989. And so I think we'll go this way. And we're going to start with you, Orville.
Well, thank you, Susie. It's great to be here with you three. And, I thought rather than to tell you something, I would just read you something that I wrote. And actually, it was an article, the first article I ever wrote for the New York Review of Books. And it sort of, I think, as I looked through it, reminded me of what an extraordinary different feeling there was in the square during those weeks, where kind of the surliness of society suddenly evaporated. So here's just a small, a little section of this report. But this feeling of ebullience also created a strangely unreal atmosphere in which some of the protesters seemed tempted to believe that nothing could hurt them. One man, only half-jokingly, told me, "We are like the boxers of 1900. We believe not even bullets can pierce us." There was that sense of invincibility. It was indeed hard to imagine any force powerful enough to disperse so many well-organized and confident people. How could there be danger when lovers were walking arm in arm and entire families were riding through the middle of the square on their three-wheel bicycle carts while their wide-eyed children were sucking popsicles? In this self-contained universe where with impunity one could read political leaflets denouncing the party or listen to political speeches in which the leadership was reviled as hopelessly corrupt and incompetent, it was hard even to imagine the outside world, much less the military cracking down. Although the protesters were demonstrating in the name of democracy and freedom of expression rather than Maoist socialism, there was a suggestion in the air of the same insular confidence that former Red Guards describe as having possessed them during the Cultural Revolution, when China was as much a world unto itself as Tiananmen was now. Insulated for a historical incident from the immense difficulties of actually changing China, young protesters and even Western journalists were all too easily swept up in the immediacy of what was happening around them. In the intoxication of the moment, it was not difficult to believe that a state of revolutionary immortality had been attained, and that some important but indefinable success was just around the corner. The atmosphere, however illusory it might ultimately prove to be, recalled Woodstock and its nonviolence, a sense of giddy liberation, and the Paris Commune, and the conviction that among the demonstrators that the people had finally risen up to secure the country's heartland from forces of reaction. So.
And with, well, do you want to go get Smith?
Sure. I mean, you just never forget watching an army pull up into the center of a capital and start mowing down protesters with automatic weapons. And it was striking that until that time, I think a lot of the younger people had kind of come to believe the government propaganda. And there were a lot of slogans about the People's Army will never hurt the people and this kind of thing. And so among some of the young people, there was a sense of just stunned shock as they were being shot at. But maybe one of the things that struck me the most was that there have been a lot of arguments during Tiananmen from officials saying that China wasn't ready for democracy, that much of the population was peasants and workers who were uneducated, who didn't understand what democracy was, that it was really more about fighting corruption than about real democracy. And those arguments were all being bandied about. And so in that context, what really struck me that night was not so much just the students, but the passion of the workers and the people from the countryside. In particular, basically the troops, they would open fire, we would all run in terror. Jianying and I just, a moment ago, we were just realizing we both lost our bicycles that night because we both fled from where we had parked our bicycles. And so then there would be a lull in the firing, and we would all want to go rescue these people who were shot between us and the troops. And none of us dared to do that. And the exception was these rickshaw drivers, who were these guys on these tricycle rickshaws with these carts on the back. And with each lull, they would drive out toward the troops and pick up the bodies of these kids who'd been killed or injured and put them on the back and race toward the hospitals. And in particular, there was this one guy who was probably from the countryside, this big burly rickshaw driver, and I just remember him he was coming back to the crowd, he saw me. I wanted a foreigner to document what was happening because he knew that they would not be able to do that. And he went by, and as he went by, he said something to the effect of, tell the world. And this was a guy who could not have articulated perhaps exactly what kind of vision of democracy he had in mind, but he was risking his life for it. And that night, watching that just taught me a certain humility about discussing whether people are ready for democracy when you see them dying for it.
I would just, there were so many memories about Tiananmen and what I went through that I replayed over the years over and over again, but I would just zoom in to a few moments. They seem to happen in quick succession. It all happened on June 3rd till the following morning. This is, I think, very much a part of what you both just have said. the sense of disbelief quickly turned into shock. And the June 3rd, the late afternoon, because I was staying at my parents' house, which is close to Chang'an Avenue. This is the main boulevard, happened to call Avenue of Eternal Peace. Yeah. So I went to there are wild rumors about that perhaps tonight is the night. There may be, the army might come in. So I went to Jianguomen Bridge, and that's where I saw the first dead body. There's a circle of people, all civilians, who have apparently stopped one of the first army APCs that had come into the city. And in its lurch, it ran over a guy. I don't know if it was one of the soldiers who's trying to run away or just a civilian. But I remember he was lying on all his four, and his brain was spelled out. And I remember this moment of saying, I've never seen a dead person with his brain spelled out, and it looked just like crushed spelled tofu. And this image stuck in me for years. And of course, when I looked up, I saw Nick right among the onlookers there. Then the next what happened, I remembered, was that evening when I biked to Tiananmen Square, there were thousands and thousands of people. They were all just ordinary Beijing citizens. And in spite of all the warnings, the broadcasts, no one left. And I remember everybody was forming these small clusters and talking about maybe there's they're going to be opening fire. But seems like no one believes it. And there were a few people saying, oh, even if they do it, it will be bullet fire. And I remember this was around midnight. There's a who sound, and there is a guy next to the cluster next to us who just fell back. And everybody thought, oh, is this bullet, real bullet? And I'm sure he died on the spot, because I remember looking over, and he's this tall, skinny guy who had a bullet through his neck and he was rushed away. But amazingly, nobody left. People stood there, I think with a sense of disbelief, as kind of a sense of innocence and solidarity, because everybody knew the students were still nearby on the square. And so close to 1:15 or so, it was the time when the army began to open fire. And just like Nick described, people ran away and couldn't believe this is happening, and it's a kind of a surreal feeling. And I was running with the crowd, but at every luau, there are a lot of people going back towards the army, towards the Tiananmen Square. And this incredible sound from these thousands of people yelling at the top of their lung. First was 大罢工. I remember the general strike, repeated many times until another rain of bullets started shooting at the people. And then there were people actually dropping back. And I remember clearly, because it was summer, so most people, Chinese, they're at that time wearing, white shirts. So you see the giant, blood as they were being carried away. And then the last time I remember, there was these people, the whole square was resonant with the scream, which is 畜生,畜生,畜生, meaning beast, beast, beast. And this sound had never went away all these years. Every time I remember that night, I remember this fury and still this passion about standing up and people throwing whatever they could from bottles or whatever they have, glasses, as they ran away. And then the last moment I remember was the next morning. I was downstairs with a bunch of neighbors from my parents' building, because we could hear the tanks. And this, for someone who grew up in peacetime, already, 10 hours ago, I saw about more than a dozen people being killed in front of me. And now I remember the sound of tanks, a row of tanks grinding through Chang'an Square. And this very old neighbor, this is a building of scholars, who said, my God, the last time I felt like this was when the Japanese entered Beijing. He was recalling, of course, the Japanese invasion of 1930s. And these are the moments I felt that was burned in my memory forever. And it was showing, I think, both the best and the worst of the city and my people.
So these are just 3 people sitting on this stage next to me, and there were millions of people in Beijing who many of whom have similar sets of memories that the government has worked over the past 30 years to modify and control and silence. And I thought maybe we could talk a little bit about what that process looked like in the early days. So Nick, when did you first begin to understand that this was going to be, that this was going to become a forbidden topic?
So the strategy changed. I mean, initially, the strategy was to constantly talk about Tiananmen and terrify people and portray it as a counter-revolutionary rebellion or counter-revolutionary riot that the troops had bravely saved the Chinese people from. And so on TV for a period, there was sort of nothing but protests and, or covering violent protests and turning the various soldiers and police officers who'd been killed into national heroes.
They televised their funerals.
They televised their funerals. They showed these just horrible, macabre scenes of some of the police and soldiers who'd been killed by protesters. And then I think they fairly quickly realized that this was an ineffective strategy, and supposedly Jiang Zemin helped instead devise an alternative strategy, which was just stop talking about it, and also change the terminology from things like counter-revolutionary riot to things like June 4th incident, to the extent you had to talk about it at all. And so I think there was a feeling that there was no real way to frame a mass uprising and bloody suppression in a way that served the Communist Party's interests. And rather, the most effective strategy would be just make it disappear. And that's what happened. So after a few months, the topic just completely disappeared. And it was erased from history to a degree that can't really happen in any other kind of country. And when social media arrived, then anything with 6/4, with June 4th, would be disappeared. And so people began to talk about things like May 35th as an alternative.
Jianying, I wonder if you can talk a little bit about these, the way that the language changed. So Nick mentioned that, that the government kind of inculcated this approved vocabulary for discussing this event, and it was a shijian, an incident, not a movement, or it was a fengbo, a disturbance, or dongluan, turmoil, but never a tusha, a massacre. And actually, I was discussing this with a colleague last week. One thing I've noticed in discussions, even among Chinese people who want to talk about Tiananmen and who want to find out the truth, is that they have a tendency to replicate these linguistic patterns, this sort of Orwellian euphemism. I mean, an incident is like when you have a fender bender in a supermarket parking lot or something, not the murder of hundreds or thousands of people. So what did that process look like? And
well, the language is so important in China, and everybody knows how to play with the language, and the officials are very insidiously doing this, not just on Tiananmen. I think on any other ugly secrets it wants to cover up, or homemade disasters that it doesn't want to, the population to remember. So, for example, the Cultural Revolution, I mean, actually, let's go even further back. The mass famine that happened in 1960 was referred to first as 3年自然灾害, or it's 3 years of natural disaster. So it was a drought that killed some people. And then then it was referred to as the 3年困难时期, the 3 years of difficulties. The Cultural Revolution, after Mao died, finally there was an official verdict referring to it as 10年浩劫, the decade of great disaster. But by now, under the current leadership, the official term has changed into 10年艰辛探索, I think. It's called a decade of difficult exploration. So these euphemisms mean something, and people on the receiving end, some know it. Others, especially the younger people who have now lived through the actual incident, actually take it at face value. If you go to the elementary school, the kids actually understood it. Oh, those are the difficult years. And then they don't ask further. So I think this language game actually is fairly successful among a good part of the population. Of course, this is excruciating for the people who actually experience it and know what's being done. So the strategy, because you're already, the state have such a dominant power over media and language and publications, that the coping strategy turned to be more euphemistic, such as the May 34th, or people who want to criticize Mao referring to him as bacon, like 腊肉, referring to the mausoleum, the embalmed body of Mao. I think over time, there's a real corrosive effect on the spirit of open discussion, because everything is distorted, of course, started by the government, by the state. But the people, in order to cope with this, also lapse into this kind of guerrilla war style of making up terms. So at the end of the day, the real issue can almost never be frontally, publicly, squarely discussed.
So, Orville, while this was sort of going on in society, there were also some major moves within the central leadership of the country to kind of address the aftermath of these events. And I wonder if you could just talk about what that looked like.
Yeah, I mean, recently there's been an interesting book published in Hong Kong about the meeting they held shortly after the June 4th, where all of the leaders were summoned, those who hadn't been purged. And there's this expression in Chinese, 表态, to sort of show deference to. So every leader had to get up in front of the Deng Xiaoping and the other ranking leaders and make a demonstration of their loyalty to the new line that Nick and Zha Jianying have just described. And that this was just, sort of one of a whole series of things that they did to kind of rectify the situation. I remember going back, and I think it was probably a month afterwards, maybe 6 weeks afterwards, and riding my bike down into the square, and riding over, you saw all the places where the tanks, where the cleat track, APCs and tanks had turned around and gouged up the asphalt, and there were bullet holes on buildings, and it was as yet unreconstructed. But in a fairly short order, in a matter of months and then years, they not only completely re-asphalted the entire avenue and filled in all the bullet holes, but they completely repaved Tiananmen Square, which is 110 acres. It was built, by the way, to be bigger than Red Square, because under that era they wanted to outdo the Russians. So
Some
that
of
is
those paving stones wound up at this drive-in movie theater outside the Third Ring Road in the
I didn't know
2000s.
that. Well, they were lowly concrete paving
Yeah,
stones.
with the tank treads. You
Yeah.
can see them. Yeah. Anyway,
That's
sorry,
interesting. Well, I'm glad they've got them some places as a memoriam. But then they got higher quality stone cut stones, and they repaved the whole place, as if to say, let's forget about any physical trace. And of course, it sort of had its analog in every other realm of life, this effort to go in and sort of excise all memory. And I just want to say one thing just before we go on about why, for me, this is such an interesting topic, not simply June 4th, but, you know, Susie and I were talking earlier, in 1946 in Germany, which is an example of a society that actually in some significant ways did confront its past, its horrible past of the Holocaust, this philosopher, who's also happened to be a psychoanalyst, Karl Jaspers, gave a series of speeches at Heidelberg University on the question of German guilt and how to overcome that and what Germany had to do to come to terms with this monstrous interim in their historical life. And for me, this is an incredibly powerful document because it suggests that, in fact, there is some human understanding that when wrong is done, you do have to go through some curative, purifying process, or what, I don't know. But it's unimaginable that a Karl Jaspers could appear in China. And so there can be no discussion, there can be no roadmap, there can be no kind of coming to terms with the past. So the question that is really ever on my mind is, can a society actually continue to develop and be healthy as it moves forward, as China urgently wants to be, if it has this sort of disembodied, disinterred, you know, corpse in its background? How does it have effect, or can you just say, doesn't matter? Don't worry about the past. Don't scratch off scabs. Don't get people fighting with each other again. Just move on and forget about it. So which of those two alternatives is the most possible?
Go ahead.
Well, I think behind this question, since you're talking about German guilt, and we're discussing the Chinese guilt here, and so as the Chinese, I think I wanted to offer my perspective, whether the question is, you know, the Chinese lacks a certain cultural genes in facing up to its inner demons.
And it's interesting that Karl Jaspers was also a psychoanalyst.
A psychoanalyst.
And a philosopher.
Yes.
So
okay.
he had that gene.
He had that gene. And psychoanalysis to this day is a difficult field to push in China because it carries such an enigma.
Yeah.
You know, people feel to admit you have a psychological problem is equivalent to saying you're deranged, you're mad. So the common attitude for every Chinese about inner demons is to leave it alone. To just leave it alone and 向前看. So I think there is something about this popular attitude of not dealing with your demons, the bad deed. However, I would say, you know, if we use the German example, let's imagine a scenario where Germany was not defeated. The Nazi Party stayed in power, and you have the portrait of Hitler still hanging to this day in the center of the Berlin Square. And the Jews who were persecuted or suffered lived among this, you know, this population who were implicated in the guilt, in the crime, under the same party. Albeit, maybe this party had changed several leaderships and are having a reform and open policies. Would the Germans have a national, their different genes, would they actually be able to carry on this national process of facing up to their past crimes?
And
So
equally
you
as
think
important.
it's conditioned on being defeated? That's the precondition to...
I would say in these cases,
reflection.
in the case of both Japan which is also Asian culture, okay, and Germany, we should not forget, above and more important than the cultural tradition, there is a regime there, there's a power who's the perpetrator of the crime. If that power, if that regime stays in power, I don't care what culture, what tradition you're coming out of, whether in Germany or in Japan, that process of a national process, I'm not talking about occasional, some, in semi-private, limited, or maybe academic circles, you can have a discussion about what happened. A national process, I don't think that's possible. So, and by the way, there is a notion of retribution in Chinese culture, whether in Buddhist or in a lot of popular, every Chinese knows this popular saying. It goes something like 善有善报，恶有恶报，不是不报，时候未到，时候一到，一切全报。This translates something like good deeds are rewarded, bad deeds are punished. If it hasn't happened, it's because the time has not arrived. When the time is arrived, all will be, everybody, you will get everything you deserve. So there is a sense of, the bad deeds will be punished. It may be a matter of time. But I do sense this is a not very, active kind of seeking a reputation. There is a fatalism in this attitude of leaving to some divine justice. And I think that is also, perhaps, in my opinion, a result of a long history of tyranny, of disasters that somehow cannot be resolved by a changing of system. The same kind of tyrannical system continues to come back. In the times we've seen now, it's still the same situation. The domination is still there by the same power. The perpetrators are staying in power. So I think there are other maybe metaphors. Unfortunately, there are lots. I've thought a lot about what would apply to this peculiar Chinese situation, where the population seem to just are, numb or passive about it. And I thought about maybe the Hegelian, metaphor of master and slave, relationship. So maybe the whole country is hijacked. And I'm not alone in this. I found actually a lot of Beijing, at least Chinese and Beijing educated intellectual friends using a similar category. For example, the Stockholm syndrome is also another useful thing. I mean, people might say, oh, this is warped because the Communist Party have come to power buoyed by popular support. But that's 70 years ago. Since then, there hasn't been an election, there hasn't been a memorandum, and there has been a series of atrocities under the same regime, the same system. So, however, at the same time, you do have, in the last 40 years, this economic miracle. So I think, there's a constant media spin about how, our common enemy is the foreign forces, right? And all the disasters should be overlooked because it's just like you have a stern father who slapped you around, slapped on your face around a little bit.
What about the kind of pervasive trauma and guilt and lack of trust that came out of the Cultural Revolution, right? I mean, because people say, oh, 89 was the moment when we saw the true face of this regime, but 20 years earlier, schoolgirls were beating their principals to death with clubs, and children were turning in their parents, and sisters were struggling against their brothers. I mean, I just wonder if maybe if that's kind of a more proximate cause for this sort of societal willingness to
I mean, it's certainly
to not want to confront the truth, right? It's spread out. It's not just the leaders.
I mean, it's certainly part of the rationale for why one has to democratic uprisings or wayward students, because that will lead to luan, to chaos. I think, I mean, in answer to the point that Orville raised about this question of, does a society have to address its guilt to be a healthy society? I sort of, I feel like, as a good liberal, I should say, of course it has to, but I'm actually not quite sure that it has to. And, one looks at American history, and we have not been great at addressing our sins. One looks at Mexico in the 1968, quite brutal suppression of the students there, or more recently in Chiapas. One looks at Nigeria and the Biafra, I don't know how many people died in Biafra, and Nigeria managed to just stop talking about it and move on. Japan as well. I mean, Japan has been awful at addressing history and war issues. But having said that, I think there is a distinction between a failure to address guilt and past, which I think is true of these places, and a positive determination that history will be erased and that it cannot be discussed.
No one can talk about it.
Yeah, and that no one can. And that, I mean, in Japan, you can talk about comfort women, even if the government doesn't want to address it. In Mexico, the same. In the U.S., excuse me. And so I think that, it really is difficult for a country to develop a modern economy and a information society when you have to train people that they can't think about certain things, that they can't discuss history, that language has to be manipulated for certain purposes. And I think that is a pretty fundamental challenge for a healthy society when the internet, for example, has to be blocked off. And in terms of China or Confucian societies and their approach to the past, there is, I think, some analogy with Taiwan. And it's the way it dealt with the Ba massacre in the late 1940s. And when I moved to Taiwan in the late 1980s, you could not talk about it. It was completely taboo, as June 4th is in China. And you had the same this prism through which people were trained that we have immense national security things, so for national security reasons, we can't open this Pandora's box. And yet, and a lot of young people didn't know anything about it. And yet it turned out that, that when freedom arrived in Taiwan, then instantly everybody wanted to talk about nothing else. Likewise in South Korea, another Confucian society, the Gwangju massacre of 1980. In the 1980s, before democracy arrived, nobody could talk about it. It was as if it did not happen. And then democracy arrives, and there's now a memorial to the massacre in Gwangju. And in Jeju now, there are efforts to address the massacres there as well. So I do think that a society can't get away with, if it wants to be healthy, if it wants to be vibrant economically and intellectually, then I think trying to rip out people's brains on that topic is incompatible with that, and that at some point there will be an equivalent to the Ba discussion, but with June 4th in
But Nick,
in China.
wasn't the key word you just said when freedom arrived,
Yeah.
when democracy arrived? That's the point I was trying to
Yeah,
make
absolutely.
earlier. That is the critical.
Absolutely.
It has to outgrow that. And I think you're right. There are plenty of incidences across history, across countries, that you don't need a moral language to develop the economy. It happened in Franco's Spain, in Pinochet's Chile, and there's, as you said, in South Korea, and many other countries. However, you can go so far with no morals and with a cynical leadership who would channel the entire country's energy into the business of making money. And that's what happened in China. And this ferocious growth partially is thanks to that. In fact, all other channels of political passion, everything is closed. So, and Chinese happen to be very hardworking, very good at making money.
So you open one door.
You open one door, and there's a flood. But you open another door at the end of the revolution. I mean, Cultural Revolution. You see what flooded out. Everybody was reading with hunger. Everybody wanted freedom, and there was a leadership at that point, fairly liberal, with the banner of emancipation of the mind, 思想解放. That's the Chinese when that door is not closed on them. That's what I mean by it's not a matter of cultural genes, it's the system. I'm sure about this one point. So I think, we're actually not disagreeing.
So I have a question for you both that follows out of this, which is if, grave consequence, it's okay perhaps if Chile does something. It's a little country of no great consequence. But excuse me, all you patriotic Chileans in the audience. But China's another kettle of fish.
Yes.
And so here's the question that vexes me. If a country like China or the United States not only doesn't get around to discussing what it's done to its people or other people in the world, it matters then because no one else around them feels very comfortable. So in other words, the fact that China is maintaining this incredibly rigid posture and has to gin itself up on nationalism and these other things makes everybody around them feel uncomfortable.
It has come to this.
Has
30 years
international
ago, I
consequences.
don't think.
Yeah, so why, I mean, it feels like the suppression has amped up over the past. I mean, I've been sort of paying attention to this story for 20 years, certainly during the years when I was living in Beijing. People we talked about this, dissidents would get taken away for a few days to a hotel. That's something that Jianying has written about. The internet would go out for a few days. The phones wouldn't work so well. But there now seems to be a so much more active, partly this has to do with capacity, right, and sophisticated technological tools, but so much more active forms of repression, particularly around history, archives closing, government attacks even on historians who study the imperial institutions of the Qing. Why do you think it's getting tighter instead of looser? I mean, if this has been such a boon to the economy, and if China has, the government line is we needed this stability in order to rise. If now they've risen, why hold on so much tighter?
Let me just give you all a very concrete example of what Susie's talking about. There's this wonderful scholar, Glenn Tiffert, who went back, took a couple of legal journals from the 1950s, for which he had hard copies, and he looked at all the articles. Then he went and he looked at the electronic archive for those articles, which the Chinese now maintain and all of our universities use because we don't have the hard copies anymore. And he compared the sort of the indexes. And he discovered that the Chinese had erased, scores of articles that didn't make China look good, that raised questions about things that happened in the 50s, counter-revolutionary, revolutionaries being taken away as rightists and one thing or another. So in other words, we find this control now is not just a control over the minds of Chinese, but insofar as we are a global society depending on each other's newspapers, scholarly journals, magazines, resources, it is corrupting the hard disk of the entire planet. So if you want to study legal studies in China, the only archive you have is the archive that China's maintained, and it's been manipulated.
I was going to say, it corrupts the planet in another important way by providing what appears to many countries around the world as a model of suppression that works. And so today, who knows where there was a massacre? What country or what capital? Come on. Sudan, exactly. Yeah, in Khartoum, Sudan today, there was a massacre of pro-democracy protesters by the military. And, Sudan gets away with it. I mean, it's kind of a 30 years later reflection on a somewhat smaller scale in Khartoum today of what happened at Tiananmen. And that is a reflection also of Saudi Arabia and UAE supporting the Sudanese government in that repression. But but China has provided, I think, a quite useful model of development, arguing that you not only can you squish people and thrive and gain influence, but that actually that's the best way to gain that influence and stature internationally.
Yeah, and I think it is erasing history and manipulating records is a great old ancient tradition in China. So going back to, some might say Confucius was the first one who selected and decided what's moral and what's not moral in these poetry. And then in all the dynasties, let's just go with the most recent, the Qing dynasty had a huge project of going through all the books to make sure to erase, because it came to power through brutal genocide and massacres. Entire cities were wiped out. And so it made sure to erase all the records of accounts of that. Anything critical was, and because that dynasty was in power for nearly 300 years, no one had seen, we're talking about 40 years, that was that long. Those books did not re-emerge until after the fall of Qing dynasty. So this is a grand tradition, and the Chinese, I think the government, now the state has caught up with that it, after all, is a ruling party, and it's actually a global empire now. It has all the resources and the high technology to do that kind of thing, that book managing. And unfortunately, I think maybe at least all of us on the stage here are, in some ways, are part of that engagement would force China open, or that through mutual benefiting, it would join the global game. I think all of us harbored that hope. Certainly, I myself, recently, I've been wanting to put myself in the dog face for having that illusion for so long. And this answering Susie's question, why, when it got rich and more powerful, instead of opening up, it now become more aggressive? I think the state draw the opposite lesson. All the economic success and the new international stature only confirms that model, that Chinese model, which is only economic reform, but state-controlled, and complete shutdown of any political reform or about these history, the issues of history, have worked, have produced economic miracle, international cooperation. Everybody now kind of feels here's a giant you have to deal with, and we all made tons of money from it. So I think it's gotten so cocky about the success of this model. It has no reason to open up. In fact, I think with this current leadership, it's abandoned all the pretense of that maybe we have to play the game.
But Jianying then entered Donald Trump.
I know, which complicates the hell out of the picture. I mean, I feel sometimes when I quote some of my, these are my heroes in China. They've been to prison for human rights. They're dissidents. They're civil rights lawyers. And now there's a large group of them who support Donald Trump, who feels, sometimes you need a bigger hooligan to fight this smaller. At least now, when it's not becoming the bigger hooligan, it's now the time to fight tough. And maybe, a gentleman cannot win this fight. So, I mean, I think whatever warped, problematic that is, I think, sometimes when I talk, I feel like I'm channeling maybe Steve Bannon, I mean, this is a big liberal town. I think people want to throw eggs at me. But some of what Bannon said, at least, is more articulate than Trump, is right about, I have a lot of issues with all the other, policies, right-wing policy. But on China, maybe Tom Friedman is right, that maybe Donald Trump is not what America deserves, but China deserves Donald Trump. It's time to call the game. before it's too late. I mean, we can debate about approaches, and trade issues are so complex. It's like someone said, this is like your grandmother's knitting. You know, maybe you should work with TPP. I'm for TPP, and multilaterally work with your allies and all this, but stand on principle. Finally, I think the West and all the moderate liberals in China have given the benefit of doubts about this moderate approach, graduate reform, patiently waiting for this country to open up, this government to maybe incrementally change. And I don't think it's totally wrong, because up till maybe 6 or 7 years ago, there are plenty of signs. There were platforms for liberal voices. Artists had a chance, and things were opening up. However, here comes this current phase. I think then everybody realized the monster is showing its ugly teeth again, and the nature of this system has never truly changed.
So Nick, Steve Bannon.
I support
Is Steve Bannon the savior of liberalism in China?
No, I didn't say that. And Steve Bannon has improved. Lately, he's been saying, let's differentiate the Chinese people from the Chinese regime. Let's differentiate. The Chinese people are the most hardworking people. This economic miracle is thanks to the hardworking Chinese people and some of those entrepreneurs in China. The regime cannot claim the credit for this whole economic growth. It's manipulating it. It's overtaking its credit for this. And just as cynical and as cold-blooded calculation as it always has. So I think even Steve Bannon is learning to make that differentiation. This is not, I don't think it's just purely a racist or nationalist agenda. It's more complicated than that, at least on China.
I do support Jianying for National Security Advisor to replace John Bolton.
Sorry to get worked up.
I disagree with you on. So I give China I give the regime more credit than I think you do for some of the gains, economically, health, universities, et cetera. We've seen a lot of countries trying to manage economic governance. It's really hard to do long-term planning, to develop ports, infrastructure, et cetera, when you have high growth rates. In China, if you compare China to Thailand, for example, you get the sense that China has actually managed that planning process quite well at technocratic level. You look at healthcare. A child born in Beijing has a longer life expectancy than a child born in Washington, D.C. That counts for something. Universities opening at the rate of 1 a week. I mean, I do think the regime gets some credit, should get some credit. On the policy side of it, I share, and I think a lot of people share, a sense of relief, if you will, that the Trump administration is pushing China on some of these fronts, with a couple of major caveats. One, that that human rights aren't a major part of this, and you look at a time when there's the greatest internment of people on the basis of religion since the Holocaust in Xinjiang, and that has to get more attention. Not only is it not getting adequate attention, but any outreach on human rights is completely undermined by our policies toward Duterte in the Philippines, Hun Sen in Cambodia, et cetera, et cetera. And secondly, that on trade and on other issues, I think we should be firmer toward China. I think we would be an awful lot more effective if we did that multilaterally rather than unilaterally. And I think we've kind of disarmed the way we've approached it. So I'm all in favor of you for National Security Advisor, not for Steve Bannon, though.
You're the more balanced liberal here. I'm just a hothead. But there come certain issues that I feel this is the time to make a principled light. It's not gonna. It would not be right to make it all about trade balances. It's not just a war about balancing the trade, or even about technology. Though I think that's technology these days means there's values, and security issues is values, and trust is values. But it should be a battle about ideals, about ideas and values.
Can you read these statements about ideals in a vacuum, as though they are isolated from the behavior of the administration in other areas? I mean, Secretary of State Pompeo put out this probably the strongest statement of praise for the heroes of Tiananmen today, and it mentioned Xinjiang, and it was like 6 paragraphs long, very strong statement about Tiananmen, but it's also coming from an administration that had a Muslim ban. And I mean, what's your sense of whether any of these principled statements, though they may feel good because we've been wanting our leaders to make them for a long time, are they really going to have an impact? How do they have an impact?
People might read it cynically about using the human rights or the Xinjiang case for the advantage of, just basically wanting to stay number one, U.S. power. And I think, we can't treat the U.S. government as just one voice, just Trump. I mean, frankly, this is relevant to tonight's topic. The moment that offended me the most during the Trump campaign was when he, in one of these GOP debate, he called Tiananmen protest a riot, and basically appreciated the fact that it took a strong government to put it down. That was deeply, insulting to me. And however, I think there are many people in the government, even in his teams. I think there are people who care about both trade and national security and military might, and some values, and some human rights value. I think it's possible that people have multiple, concerns and values. I don't know if they all arrange it in the same sequence as we do. I mean, we're here to talk about human rights. We're focused on human rights, and I think people talking about, the worst about this trade war is China will delink. How do you say?
Decouple.
Decouple. But what about relink human rights and all the values we care about with this negotiation in this current, make it not just about trade, relink. I mean, that was a weapon, or what do you call it, whether it's called a whip or a way of working together on certain basic line, values 30 years ago. And the U.S., I think, in a moment of, political expediency, or maybe some well-intended long view of, through engagement, basically abandoned that card. Throw that card out.
Let me defend engagement for a minute. I too
No,
am
I'm sandwiched
a
between
disillusioned
good
engagement.
liberals. Okay, I gladly play
I think it was absolutely right for the United States and other countries to seek to lead temperately, moderately, and intelligently by trying to engage China, particularly coming out of the 80s, when there was an incredible optimism. Nick, you covered it, that period. You remember. There were all sorts of new political reforms going on, and economic reforms, and things being translated in discourse and discussion. And sadly, 1989 ended that. That was the moment the line was drawn, and after that, the Chinese Communist Party decided that was the death warrant of the party. And, yes, we had a little recrudescence of openness under Jiang Zemin, a few things. But anyway, what I fear is happening is, however compromised Bush is, and however much he doesn't espouse the kind of American values that I espouse.
You mean Trump?
Trump, excuse me. I think we're heading into a period where we are sadly approaching a kind of clash of something, whether it's values, systems, culture, whatever you want to call it, where China is beginning, as Nick suggests, to sort of formulate an alternative model that works. It works in trade, it works in economic development, and at the same time, our model is looking increasingly sort of in a state of collapse. And that's what I fear, because I, frankly, just speaking very personally here, I don't want to live in a system where I'm under 24-hour surveillance and facial recognition and all of the things that are now being elaborated out in China. So that, to me, is the dangerous new world that we have entered, and why I think China becomes infinitely more important to us, not just in the matter of trade, but on the matter of evolving different ways of being in the world.
Yeah, I'm curious about something, whether you, so you said that Tiananmen was kind of the turning point there.
The start of a turning point.
Well, I go back and forth on that, whether the Tiananmen was the turning point, because then, of course, afterward, I mean, there were a couple of really bad years there, and then beginning in 1992,
Yes.
Deng Xiaoping's Southern Tour, things began to
Clinton
open
and
up
Jiang
again.
Zemin were pretty good years.
Yeah, and Jiang Zemin had a vision of opening up,
Yep.
that you would have village elections, township elections, eventually county elections, maybe provincial, there was, you could imagine a trajectory under Jiang Zemin.
So
And then-
that defends the engagement argument.
Yes,
Yes.
so then under Hu Jintao, then everything was frozen, and then now under Xi Jinping, it's going backward. But I wonder to what extent, I mean, one way of seeing this was all kind of inevitable, and Tiananmen just sort of determined that. The other way of thinking of it is that a certain amount of it is just arbitrary, and whoever
Yes.
happens to end up as the leader, and that if it had been not,
Yeah. I totally agree. I think to see it in a kind of historical determinism way is going too far.
No, I don't
Because
agree with
it-
that. But imagine if 1989 had not happened, and Zha Jianying continued on as party general secretary.
Yeah.
I think we'd be that the possibility of reform and engagement might still be alive today.
yeah, I agree.
Not even that far. I mean, if there was a struggle for a moment 60 years ago or 7 years ago, maybe Li Keqiang, if Li Keqiang had
Yeah.
won out, I think it would be quite different. Even if Bo Xilai won out, I think at least we'll have more fun, a slightly more urban version of
You'd be
what's
singing
happening.
Maoist anthems, but other than that.
Well, because these are leadership close to my generation. I think we all had this kind of hope that by the time this cultural revolution generation comes along, we have learned the lesson of the Cultural Revolution. We would not go back to that Maoist, ideology. We wanted to engage with the world. However, if you, of course, this is all in hindsight. You look back, that generation is divided. There were people like, Li Keqiang is kind of my same year we entered
Went to
Beijing
college
University,
right
went to
after
college. So
after
is
the
Bo Xilai is just speaking of that, but not the current leadership. Xi Jinping has never passed the exam to go to he was one of what you call the worker soldier, what you call 工农兵学员, right, to go into that. And he's the leader who spent the longest time in the countryside. You might say he is more in touch in that way with the sort of the reality at the ground.
But
and
he's
how to
not cosmopolitan.
Is definitely the opposite. So I mean, in some ways, this is there's an accidental factor here. You can't predict who actually happened to be in that leadership position at this time. So in that sense, I would say, the engagement mindset made certain degree of sense. You don't want China to go off into this closed door isolation, to the world. At that point, there is still a degree of possibility that this thing could evolve in a positive direction.
Do you think it's still
So
can?
I want to say something on that hopeful note, and then we really have to let the audience ask us some questions. But as we were preparing for tonight's event, about a month ago, ChinaFile put out a call on social media for young people who had grown up in China after 1989 to tell us their stories about how they first learned about the events of the spring of 1989 and how they felt about it. And we collected a few dozen of these stories, and a selection of them are on the website now. And one of the things that really struck me, and obviously this is a self-selected group of people who wanted to interact with ChinaFile, many of them are living abroad, but so many of them have this similar story of growing up in China and hearing a little something about what happened in 1989 because somebody dropped it into a conversation, or they heard something at school, and then they were told, this is forbidden, don't talk about it, often by their own parents. Please don't talk about this, you could be in danger. And it was that shutting down of their curiosity that the moment they left China, or the moment they were able to figure out how to use a VPN, if they were in the slightly older generation when the internet was easier to use in China, the first thing they did was to go and look into these forbidden topics. And to me, that's the counterpoint to this story about different systems, right? Is that there are these, I guess I still believe, these universal, there's a universal human desire for the truth. And many of the people that wrote these stories said that for them, the most heartbreaking thing about learning about Tiananmen, about watching, for instance, the documentary Gate of Heavenly Peace, wasn't the massacre. It was seeing this version of China in the weeks before that was so open, that was so trusting, that was so exuberant, and that witnessing that has sort of planted a seed within them to want that for their country. So I don't think it can be totally crushed out.
I'm with you.
So with that, we will now open it up for questions. So again, just please wait. It's a little hard for me to see you because it's very bright. Just wait until you have a microphone in your hand, and then you can ask a question. So
I see
yes,
one.
up here on the aisle.
Hi, you talked about the country going backwards. In
Maybe
terms of,
introduce yourself so we know who we're talking to.
hi, I'm Charles Henderson. You talked about the country going backwards. Do you think the reaction of the government is in response to what they seem to think is cracks in their control over its people, or is it just some form of deviation that they like to just have power?
I'm not sure I understood the
Okay, can
question.
you repeat that?
Could you repeat that?
Yeah.
Is it?
The question is on control. Is the government reacting to something they see within the country that they're afraid of, or is it something else?
Is it about insecurity, or is it about confidence? I mean, this is a big
I mean,
question.
I think that, China is very much a one-party Leninist state. And in the Leninist toolbox, the biggest tool is control. So that is usually the answer to every problem. Whereas in other societies, you might say, all right, let's let people express themselves. Let's have a town hall meeting. Let's have an election. So I think what's happened in China is a deep recognition of profound and threatening fissures within society, within the economy, within the body politic. And every time they see one of those, they reach almost autonomically for more control. And it is an expression of their recognition of certain kinds of incipient weaknesses. But it also winds this thing up like some watch that's overwound until the spring snaps. That's the danger of this sort of, I think, kind of a system.
Do you think we're in that kind of a moment, Jane? Does it feel like an overwound?
Yeah,
watch?
in Chinese has a saying about the recent moment. It's something called 挂倒档踩油门, means it's put on the gear is put on the reverse, and you're stepping on the pedal. Meaning, the retrogressive motion is so, astounding. I mean, especially in the ideological spheres. It wants to control, the party cell wants to be embedded in so many, in schools, in companies, in universities. The surveillance is like spreading with this new technology called Tiananmen, right? This is called the Sky Eye. The government wants to control more and more people. I'm not saying there's no private space left. There is. Even on the internet, even on the WeChat, there are lots of pockets of fair fairly open spaces. People can still discuss certain things, but that space is rapidly shrinking. So,
yeah, I mean, for a regime like that, there are kind of two strategies. There's what Singapore did or the Guomindang did in Taiwan, which is you gradually ease the pressure and evolve and open up and become somewhat more tolerant, versus what China has done or what South Korea did in the 1960s, 70s through the late 80s. And I think that, I mean, the irony is that China, the Communist Party, for much of its period, it could have gone the way of the PRI in Mexico and actually had elections that it would rig to give itself greater legitimacy. They could have had provincial elections where they have two people who are largely the same, and they could have, I mean, I think the peasantry would have largely supported them. You just don't have mayors for elections in the big cities, things that can go wrong. And I think that it becomes harder for the Chinese Communist Party to do that for two reasons. One, that so many leaders and their families are so corrupt that a free press becomes really dangerous because everybody has completely enriched themselves beyond any plausible explanation. And the other is this question of history that they have, that the moment that they themselves that have benefited from killing students. We were talking earlier that the May 4th movement in 1919 has echoed through China. One person was killed. In Tiananmen we don't know, but hundreds were. And I think that it's very difficult for them to make that transition the way some of these other countries did when they have so much blood on their hands.
Yes, here. Oh, there's Phyllis.
Great panel. And Zha Jianying, I wanted to ask you to address the question of why it's so difficult for Chinese to talk, even amongst themselves and their families, about Tiananmen. I'm not sure if this essay was published on your site or another, but there's a beautiful essay by University of Chicago Chinese physicist. Was that you? Were you guys?
Yes, and I recommend you all read this essay.
Yeah.
It's on ChinaFile right now.
Very, very moving. But she talks about how she was slapped down. Her family told her don't talk about it, and her reasoning was that a fear of the Cultural Revolution. So I wondered if you could talk about that, and then would anyone care to address the effective end of one country, two systems in Hong Kong?
Oh. Yeah, that's a very moving essay. I think it really is symptomatic of a lot of this phenomena of fear. And her parents would be my generation. And so I think this going back to the earlier phenomena, here's a society and a culture that's sort of endured so many disasters and still living under more or less the same political system and with the overwhelming imbalance of power. So things could happen again. You say, oh, this horrible things happened and maybe not next. However, you have full expectation that it will repeat again. So so many people have kind of internalized that trauma, just live with it and deal with it, and they're constantly afraid that not only themselves, but the worst is that their children will be exposed to that kind of danger, whether knowing too much, therefore can be ostracized at school because you basically expect everybody else is thinking in this kind of self-protective, pragmatic calculation of not telling the truth. So if you're the one who tells that, put your child in a worse situation because she'll be the only one who knows, who's poking that. And so I think that is a kind of a poisonous and a kind of a sickness that you live within yourself to suppress what you know is like an ugly kind of scar or wound. And she did not ask until she left the country. And you hear so many, and I think a year ago, I talked to a group of graduate students, some of our young professionals in the East Coast area, all from China. And I remember when they asked me point blank to talk about June 4th, the whole room fell into such a silence. And it was both a kind of a fascination and shock and fear. Afterwards, they all said they really, not only they did not want to poke about this when they're in China, even now, as long as there's a chance they're returning to China, they want to keep a low profile about these things. They don't want to be known to be, to be onto this kind of ugly secret. So I think this internalized kind of fear explains a lot about why so many Chinese seem to don't care. I think they don't dare to care. They're interested, but they don't dare to be interested. So again, I think this is a syndrome that we're talking about. It's not a normal reaction.
We got another really astonishing story from one of the people that wrote into us. She was a journalism student, and her father was a journalist, and he came home one day in 2007, and a local newspaper in Chengdu had printed an ad in its classified section that said, standing with the mothers of the Tiananmen, of the June 4th victims. And it had run in the paper, even though it should have been censored. And it turned out that what had happened was that the editor who was in charge of reviewing ads didn't know what it meant, because she had never learned.
Yeah.
And the woman who wrote this story said her father came home and said, how could that editor have been so stupid? I hope you never do anything this stupid. I hope you never say anything about June 4th. And the author looked up at her dad and said, what's June 4th? And he said, well, how can you not know? But he had never even told his own daughter. So this it creates these perverse kinds of dynamics.
And the perversity, I think, goes to a next level. It's not just an amnesia, it's a selective amnesia. Because if you ask people about Opium War or the rape of Nanjing, you get treated to a lecture. Every school child, every grown-up can tell you everything about it. But the more recent homemade atrocities or these incidents, far fewer people know or are willing to talk about it. And how this has not happened naturally. I mean, you know from their reaction, their ferocious reaction about people being killed in Nanjing under Japanese hand, or back generations, they have no idea. They don't know the British, the Opium War, but they have this acute reaction to it. So they're actually, the human reaction to killing is the same. But the more recent memories are erased or numbed out of this, because I think, again, you know who's the black hand here. It's constantly amplifying one thing and erase another. Results, of course, in these selective memories, right? And it's good for, on the part of the state, it's all good. You fan up nationalism, and people get caught up in that. It's a perfect deflection from, these other
it was interesting, during June 4th, one of the big slogans, you saw it on myriad banners, was "Hey Bai Diandao," that you call black white.
You call white black.
Or either way.
Yeah, exactly.
And that's, of course, exactly what's going on now. And that was the big critique of the media and the propaganda organs. So the question, and I don't know, I know we're getting to the end here, I just want to raise it again. Does this matter? And if it does, what are the ultimate consequences for a country like China?
I'm asking questions. You're giving the answers.
I believe there's a consequence.
Yeah.
I mean, I think it is a matter of time. But I think, because there is such powerlessness in China to enact their memory, and I mean, because even as we speak now, I've been receiving from China these messages with candles, with songs, with motion to fast. I'm enjoying that, but it also makes me terribly sad in the way that I hear about these Tibetan self-immolations. People feel such despair, such powerlessness that they have no platform, no tools to voice their emotions except their own body, their own stomach. They can starve themselves. This is this is literally the message that this is the one thing that the police and the state cannot rob us from. You cannot go on the street to hold a candle, but you can not eat to make sure you remember, and your heart is with the memory of those who paid with their lives. So I think this is really, to demand a whole country who's lived through such warped, memory and with such absence of power to fight back. This is something for the international community, for the media to help, to contribute in this common fight, because it's not just about China. It's about all of us, especially now that China is so big.
I want to end there, but I think we might have time for just one more. If somebody's really burning to ask, okay, somebody way up at the top.
I want to thank everyone on this excellent panel. My name is Maura Moynihan, and I went to China in 1975 during the Cultural Revolution, because I had been living in India, and I spent many years working for Radio Free Asia. And I remember well the events of Tiananmen. I thank all of you for your excellent reporting. And I have found it rather morally repugnant and politically dangerous to watch Democrats and Republicans commit to a policy of appeasement with the Chinese Communist Party. Because if the Indian government or the Russian government or the Japanese government or French government stole $600 billion worth of intellectual property every year, slaughtered the students in the square, got away with it, as my friend Dr. Schell's pointed out, they'd pay a price, but China up till now has never paid a price. And I'm a liberal Democrat, but I spent last weekend watching Steve Bannon talk about China for almost 12 hours on my YouTube account. I almost burnt my laptop, and I agreed with everything he said. So I did. And so
Do you have a question?
Yeah, the question is, why is the West committing to a policy of appeasement? And where's it going?
Why are we, do we have a policy of appeasement? Let me just very quickly go back and say, I'm not much of an appeaser. However, I do think that it was the right thing for the United States to try to do, to try to lead. And if that involved a kind of suspension of belief through some very difficult times, I can forgive that in the hopes that maybe China could have had a peaceful evolution out of its one-party sort of state, period. And it hasn't worked out that way for a whole variety of reasons, some of which we've discussed here. I think we've come to the end of engagement, frankly speaking. But I don't think it was a wrong thing to try.
But are we stopped? I mean, has history stopped in China? Are we just now at the end point?
Different views on that.
Look, I think we should be much tougher toward China, but I don't think we should stop engaging with China any more than I think we should not engage with Iran or engage with North Korea.
But maybe our mythology about us on a convergent pathway.
I think we should
do for a lapse.
Understand that it's not sort of waving a wand and a little bit of trade and all of a sudden democracy will break out. But I do, look, we have interests in as well as values at stake, and we have to engage with China, not only because there is a vast amount of trade, intellectual property around. We have to deal with North Korea, the South China Sea, the East China Sea.
Climate change.
Ivory, Iran, all kinds of issues, and I think it's and also one way of raising issues like Xinjiang and Uyghurs is by engaging, and I think we should engage. I think we should invite Chinese leaders here, but I think we should also, when they come, very publicly say that we have raised the issue of 1 million or more Uyghurs being detained there, and raise issues of the rule of law and and history and so on. So I hope to see continued engagement, and I don't think engagement is a dirty word, but I completely agree that it has to be a little less giddy and exuberant
And it takes two.
Takes two to
Yeah.
dance. Yeah, I think maybe
Final
there's
word.
something that the West or the democracy could learn from a certain attitude in China. I mean, this is a nasty thing to say, but I think the Chinese, if I could get inside the mind of the Chinese, government at that moment, it was you roll out tanks already to crush a peaceful protest of your own people. This is, as Fang Lijie is absolutely right to say, this is the only case where a nation invades itself. Not a few bullets, but tanks. And so, but it has actually crossed over. It overcome a certain compunctions or qualms. There's a Chinese saying that goes something like, 狮子多了不咬，债多了不愁. I don't know if you know this. It means if your body is covered with lice, then you don't feel the bite. And if you piled up too many debts, then you don't worry. So you already did the worst, the most unthinkable. So after that, let's do capitalism with, Chinese character, rob the nation or take advantage. In the meantime, of course, the people got something. I think you're right. You are more balanced than I am to give some credits to the, I mean, this approach has lifted such a large chunk of humanity out of poverty. I mean, bravo to that. That deserves all the credit on earth. However, it crossed a certain moral line. And after that line crossed, it has no reservation. I mean, I don't think the other side will pull back like what we're all thinking. Oh, maybe we should not be so, maybe we'll be accused of containment will be imperialism in a new age, or maybe this is kind of America having trouble with being number two. So this is all about power and greed, about nothing else. I think we should overcome that kind of thinking that this is just about we have to give the other side due. I don't know what do you call that. Let's not fight. Let's not throw. What's the word? Throw down the gauntlet.
Yeah.
I mean, Xi Jinping talks about 亮剑 all the time, showing your sword. He's the real man, right? 出真男儿, whatever, like Putin. Here you have, of course, here people would think about Trump again, but I mean, I don't think you need to fight a hooligan's fight. You can stick to your principles, but still be tough. Still, don't make too many excuses for this so-called economic miracle, for how much benefits that the corporations here already made. It's true. But it's supposed to be a win-win game. How about, I mean, you wrote about it. How about reciprocity? The game is not fair. I mean, it's 15 years of WTO, 30 years since Tiananmen is forgiven, more or less. Isn't that enough?
I don't think this is a conversation that can really have an end on this stage tonight, unless you all want to stay for a few more years. But I think we will we'll end here. And please help me by thanking our panelists.